Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the Bishop on a Bike podcast. Have we got a treat for you today? If there is anybody that I would like to talk to about what is shifted in American Christianity, it is Reggie McNeal. Reggie he lives in South Carolina. We had this conversation via Skype, and so you'll notice the audio quality is a little bit different than when you're used to, but it's such a worthwhile conversation. He has a new book out called Kingdom Collaborators. He's also the author of a book that I stole the title of for our Synod Assembly last year, and we're going to get into talking about that right off the bat. This is a chance to talk with somebody who sees what's going on in American Christianity in a unique perspective. It's the shift from being a church internally focused to an externally focused ministry, and that's what this conversation is all about. Once again, I want to thank the Mission Investment Fund for their support of this podcast. And without any further delay, let's get into my conversation with author Reggie McNeal and his new book, Kingdom Collaborators. I just want to start with saying that I am just so excited to be talking to the man who authored the book, Get Off Your Donkey, because I just... I love that title, and we used it last year at our Synod Assembly, much to the chagrin of a few folks.
I bet. I got some pushback as well. So, I'm thinking, come on, people. I mean, that title actually came as a bit of it was a mistake, and maybe I should have not done it. But I was speaking to a group, and I said, about the Good Samaritan, that story. And I just happened to make the comment, nobody really got any help in that story until somebody got off their donkey. And, the group just laughed uproariously. And it took me a minute to realize what I'd said. And I thought, I could use that as a book title. But anyway, I think it sold 12 copies. And, along with...
I bought 3 of them, so...
No, I'm teasing. But, but it is kind of funny. Come on, folks, lighten up. I mean, we need to somehow be happy with something, anyway.
Yep, exactly.
The point of Get Off Your Donkey is that we really do need to put action to loving our neighbors. It's not just an idea. Jesus actually expected us to move toward pain and move toward opportunity. And in the story, the remarkable thing is it's church people that don't come off so well there. And it's a Samaritan who is not favored, who actually winds up doing God's work in the story. And I think that's instructive for those of us who are in church leadership, that Jesus wasn't just making up scripture when he said love neighbor. He actually intended us to do it.
We're kind of seeing a shift, and I think my sense is from the following you over the years and the books you've been writing, you've been at the center, or one of several people have been at the center of making this shift in our church life from a church-centered to a kingdom-centered approach. And obviously it's not something new because it goes back to Jesus. We're just like rediscovering that. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think so, Jim. It's been interesting to see how the language has shifted through the years. I mean, I came on, over a couple decades ago now, talking about missional stuff early on in that conversation, and my language is, had to invent a word, but my language is more and more now adopting the biblical notion of kingdom and kingdom language, which, there is fuzzy for many people. But for me, the kingdom is about the life that God intends, because the kingdom's all about life. I mean, we open the Bible in a garden with a tree of life at the middle. We close the Bible in a city with a river of life flowing down through it, with trees of life on both sides. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, the life. And he says, I've come to give life. So to me, kingdom is about the life God intends for you and me to enjoy. And the great kingdom saga is the extent that God will go to, including wrapping himself in flesh, visiting the planet, and living the life in front of us that he intends for us to live. Now, what happened is with particularly the third century and by the fourth century, the Christian movement, the church movement that Jesus established, moved from the streets and became a more institutionalized version. Well, without beating up on stuff that a lot of people have commented on through the years. Now, for 1,700 years, we've been really pursuing the Christian movement largely through church as institution. And even with the Reformation, which of course you Lutherans own, even from the Reformation, it was a church-centric effort to try to fix the church. Let's get it right. And what I'm suggesting is that we've got to move that the alignment or realignment has to go much further than let's just purify the church doctrine or how we do the sacraments or who gets to do what when. Let's go back to the original movement. And because the kingdom is God's major concern, and Jesus established the church, gave us keys to the kingdom. The only reason the church exists is to point people to the kingdom. So I'm saying let's realign with the kingdom message. And that's what I mean by being more kingdom centric. And what that means practically is that the church quits existing for itself, worried about its own life, and we actually begin to pay attention to the quality of life of people around us, kind of back to that Good Samaritan thing again. We're supposed to be improving the lives of people around us, meeting their needs, moving toward the hurt, listening to pain, making sure that we're doing everything we can so that people have access to the life that God intends. That's a long, long answer to your question.
Challenges I think we have is we trained a generation or two or three into being the church is about the building and what happens on Sunday and some committees that meet during the week.
Yep.
And now we've got to make a shift. In a sense, we have to say to those folks, well, all that we did for the last 60, 80, 100 years, actually, that was wrong. I mean, not 100% wrong, but because we do need structures and institutions do matter. But the focus of all of our energy, that's really hard on a local level to change a congregation. I just did a 125th anniversary of one of our churches last weekend, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how do you turn that thing around?
Yeah. Well, and you are right. This is if you're called into giving leadership of the church in this era, probably since the Reformation, you have to go back that far to find a task that is as similarly as daunting, because what it's going to require of you as a church leader is to shift an entire culture, not just adopt, go out and have one Sunday a year that you don't have church and you go clean off windshields of people, or something, and then say, oh, we're missional, we're a kingdom-minded church. No, it requires a shift of an entire culture. And to do that, and I get into that, and I know you may want to discuss it later, but that requires that we actually shift the storyline of what we talk about, the narrative, because the narrative has all been about our church mission. How's our church doing? Please come to our church. Our church has really got it going, and has really become the narrative of saying, well, we need to turn people into church people in order for them to, connect up with a movement. Well, that's just so non-biblical. It's not even funny. And yet we accept that as normal. And then we have to not just change the story that we talk about, but we have to change the scorecard. And I'm not naive to believe that we're going to quit counting how many people show up at church on Sunday, or how much money they bring with them, or how often they come. I'm not naive about that, but I'm I argue that we've got to expand the bandwidth of how we celebrate. And that's what I mean by scorecard. What is it that we celebrate? Are we engaged in the local schools and helping kids learn to read? Are we somehow diminishing hunger, or are we adding to economic opportunity, or are we, involved somehow in reducing, human sex trafficking? I mean, these are things going on in our communities in the real world that if we are God's people, we should be making a dent. We ought to be moving the needle on that somehow. And so changing the scorecard to, or what we celebrate, to begin to, talk about how many fewer hungry kids we have in our school system because we packed backpacks for them for the weekend, or how many first graders came off the at-risk list in literacy, or how many of our people are reading to kids, or involved in community service hours. Those kinds of things, I think, are important, and we can revisit that in a little bit, because I want to go ahead and get the third piece out. And that is really, to the leaders that are listening, it requires a new stewardship on our part. We've got to quit thinking of ourselves as simply stewards of an institution. We have to think of ourselves as leaders of a movement. And there's a whole different set of competencies, and not just attitudes, but genuine competencies that are involved in becoming a leader of a movement. I will say, Jim, and I know I've been rambling here for a while, but I want your listeners to know I understand church as institution is not going to go away, and I'm not calling for that. People hear things I don't say all the time. What I'm suggesting is that the Spirit is not just whispering, but is yelling to the church in North America that if we want to join God in what He is up to, we're going to have to get out of institutional modality exclusively. Think about how God is showing up on the streets, because that's where He's doing most of His work, not in the church. And we're going to have to join God in His work in the streets. That's going to hook us back into the movement of the kingdom of God. And that's the massive realignment we need to make to remain, or to regain relevance in this culture.
On the institutional level, or the opportunity is when I've seen this, when congregations have made that shift, what they actually experience is a re-engagement with the institutional side of the church. In other words, people see, oh, look, that's the church that helps people. I want to be a part of that kind of thing. And it's not that they want to be a part of the church as the institution. They want to be a part of the institutional aspect of the church because of the work that it is doing in the community. Now, we need to be careful, because some people might hear what I just said as saying, oh, this new being externally focused on the community is a new church growth technique. And I think in this day and age, people are going to see right through that. So that's not what I'm advocating. Absolutely. But I do think.
No, you're exactly. And thank you for giving that caveat, because I would say the same thing. We can't do this simply to serve ourselves. I mean, we need to make this shift simply to serve the God that's called us into being His people, and as obedience, and as being the church, not just doing church. I would say one thing, though, that stands out. It's just so glaringly obvious. It's amazing how we miss it. Everyone sits around and laments the lack of interest, in growing lack of interest in our culture of institutional expressions of religion, not just the Christian church. I'm talking about any organized religious anything. So you have the rise of the religious. You have the rise of the duns. We're done with that. So you got the nuns and the duns both saying, and then of course you go down the generational food chain and you get to the millennials, and 1 in 3 say no thanks to any organized religious anything. And that's moved from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 in less than a decade. It's an enormous shift. Well, congregations are sitting around thinking, how can we do more interesting church stuff to get these millennials engaged? Well, get over it. What you're suggesting and what I'm observing is that millennial generation has kingdom values square in their wheelhouse. I mean, when God wants to change a culture, he doesn't consult us. He just puts a whole new set of values in a new culture or in a new generation. And these millennials want to have positive impact on big societal issues. Any congregation that decides to go that way is going to become more attractive to millennials, not because their service is better or they hired a really sexy sax player or they finally figured out the best coffee to serve or whatever it is. It's because that congregation is actually doing something to help people live a better life. There will be people all over your community that will be attracted to that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things that you've done there is you just articulated some really key and practical things that you suggest in the end of your new book, Kingdom Collaborators, where you talk about the storyline and the scorecard and the stewardship. And I just want to highlight a couple of things, and this is where your book really comes to life in terms of some practical things, like what can a pastor or a lay leader in a congregation do. And you've got honor government officials and educators who are in the trenches daily. Tell the stories of business people. Elevate the roles of those who are befriending their neighbors, starting book clubs to have spiritual conversations. Display the work of artists from your community. Pray for frontline healthcare workers. Extol the efforts of those serving in social services agencies. I mean, just those are all things that anybody could start doing this coming Sunday in their congregation, and those kinds of activities of just including those people in your prayers is the beginning of this kind of shift in a culture of a congregation.
You're right, Jim. And I also encourage all of my clients. We get really serious about inviting community leaders into our worship service and interviewing them, so that we can expose the folks that are sitting there in the pew. If they've been in the bubble so long, or they're just not in a position to know what's going on. But I tell you, bring a mayor in, or a city council person, or a healthcare official, or goodness, the guidance counselor at the local high school, because they're dealing with everything that shows up. I mean, everything that's going on in your community is manifesting in the public school system. Interview these folks in front of your congregation. Pray for them. Look for who seems to be interested in what they're saying. Begin to build on that interest and passion. Make heroes of those people then, telling their stories of how mentoring this 8th grade kid has changed their life. And you just begin to be a viral. That's how you spread the virus.
That's a great suggestion. Wonderful. So let's just talk a little bit about this new book of yours, Kingdom Collaborators.
Sure.
This kind of, as I read it, it continues this theme that you've been on, and I want to. When I first looked at the table of contents, and I saw that, okay, so this is 8 signature practices of leaders who turn the world upside down, and I opened the table of contents and I saw right there, okay, the first one's prayer. And I got to be honest with you, when I first thought it, I thought, oh, here we go, just kind of that perfunctory nod to, yes, we need to make sure we're including prayer as central. But then when I read the chapter, I was really surprised, because you have a decidedly different approach to prayer. You're really putting an emphasis on listening, which is certainly not either your tradition nor my tradition's approach to prayer. I mean, my tradition is, we have them grammatically correctly written out 4 months in advance and then published in the worship book so that we can read it. And your tradition is similar, but has a different style in terms of it's about talking to God. You flipped that and said, no, we need to listen. Tell me about that.
Well, it's interesting because I'm getting a lot of conversation and a lot of positive response to that particular chapter. And everyone admits to what you were saying. Oh, here's another chapter on how to get things said right to God. And I contend that, while I grew up understanding prayer as God's gift to me so I could talk to him, I'm becoming more and more convinced that prayer is God's gift to us, so that He can bring us up to speed on what's going on around us. I mean, honestly, how many times have you sat through places where we, share prayer requests, and at the end we pray as if God wasn't listening when we were sharing requests?
Done
And
that myself
I
as
mean,
recently as last week in a staff meeting.
I mean, is that good? And then I listen to people in prayer, come up with the strategy that God could use if He would just hurry up and do something. And we offer lots of suggestions to Him. Are you kidding? I mean, prayer. This is such a precious gift that God has given us to say if we'll just tune in. And Luther said it. I mean, Luther talked about there is a voice, that I've learned to distinguish above all others, now, because there are lots of voices in our head, that our self-talk channel and the enemy talk channel and the world talk channel. But I think God, the Spirit, is speaking to us all the time about pay attention to this. Listen for the work I'm doing in someone's life. Listen to what I'm saying through, the events of the day, because God is not. I mean, His kingdom is not incidental to all this stuff. It's right smack in the middle of all this stuff.
Yeah, well, and I
Um,
think that's
and
I
so,
think that's part of too of it. It's this split between the sacred and the secular, and we've kind of, prayer is something
yes,
that we relegate to a spiritual activity, and then we're going to go ahead and have our meeting, and that's the secular work, and we're not integrating those things at all.
yeah, we kind of sprinkle prayer at the beginning and the end, like fairy dust, to make sure we somehow sacralize this. And now let's do the real business. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just all I can say is that personally, I spend less and less time uh, informing God of what's going on here, like He needs it, um, in my prayer life. The only way you can pray without ceasing is not to be a nonstop talker, but to be a nonstop listener.
Yeah. Well, for me, that chapter was worth the price of admission, and since your publisher sent me the book for free, it was a real gift. Um, but
It's a low
it's a
threshold to
low
get over,
threshold,
isn't
but
it?
no, I just really found that very refreshing, and certainly this conversation is convicted me on my own sprinkling of fairy dust in my work, and called attention.
Well, I don't mean that in a sense. I'm trying to say it's hard to read a smile through
Right,
an
it's a
audio,
big
but
smile.
I'm saying this. I'm saying this with a grin and a smile and how much of my own life I've done this. And if people are saying, well, practically, what do? Do you just go out and get in an own position and try to? No, I mean, one of the best ways I listen to God is I replay the tapes of the day. You know, I'll, at the end of the day or the next day, or as I rethink the previous activity, and just open that up for comment. I mean, God's a magnificent coach. He's got all these tapes. This is what great football and sports coaches do. They capture stuff on film and they play it. He'll sit through that session with you and he'll say, the reason you thought that was a speed bump, that was a person you ran over yesterday. Or he'll also say, you see that, McNeal? That's what I'm looking for. Way to go. I mean, coach is not just there to slap us on the wrist or, bong us on the head when we do something boneheaded. He's there to encourage us to the stuff. So I don't know. I think it's just really important that we get in a debrief modality and allow the Spirit to comment. That for me, that would be one helpful suggestion I would make for people that want to listen more but don't
Yeah,
know
that
how.
that is really helpful in terms of just looking at just reflecting on your day or the previous day, which does require well, is for time alone, by yourself. But also I know my wife would probably say, well, I'd rather do that in conversation with somebody. Well, I think that could certainly be an equal approach. It's going to be a different approach for different folks, but that reflecting on, and just simply asking the question, okay, where was God in that? What was God trying to
Yeah.
say and lead me and prompt me or help me avoid making a fool of myself again? Whatever it may be. Yeah, helpful.
Well, and my wife would be at home with yours in that she's a more, I'm semi-reflective. My wife is very external in her thinking, and so she prefers to be in company of folks, even as we come to certain understandings. And so, God has spoken to me lots of times through other people. And in fact, maybe more often than any other way, as I listen to other people talk about either their insight or, I hadn't thought about that, or just, or I think even as we're talking with people about their own spiritual journeys, for instance, I don't. My upbringing told me to start a spiritual conversation with something like, you're disconnected from God and you're going to go to hell, and which is hardly an invitation to a conversation.
Right.
That pretty well ended the conversation. Um, but to just ask people about their dreams. See, I think their dreams is a vestige of the kingdom of God in us. Where do those dreams come from? If there's not, it's an outside reference point. Even the notion that something is not as good as it could be or wrong, where does that come from? That's not something we dream up from within ourselves. There's some kind of external something there that's informing that. And of course, I think that's the kingdom that we're operating inside of, and the God who is the king, who has magnificent dreams for people's lives. And as we are able to articulate those, we're getting in touch with that. So most of my spiritual conversations these days start with something along the idea of, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? In fact, even hope. Hope is a counter cultural notion right now in America, I can tell you. And it's a countercultural message for people who are living in anxiety, and are divided and are at odds politically, and in this fractured nation that just continues, seem to be on some disintegrative trajectory. God's people ought to be speaking hope into this.
Yeah. Amen to that. Yeah. And so just to kind of shift then back to your book, but I think there is a theme of listening in it. So I'm not going to make you walk through all 8 of these signature practices, because then nobody go out and buy the book. But the next one is, fomenting a dissatisfaction with the status quo. And in that you talk about this idea of selling the problem. And I think that that's very wise, because I myself have a lot of great solutions for a lot of other problems, that if I could just get other people to do what I think is the right idea that I have, it seems like it'd be a much more efficient approach. But that doesn't work. So you have this selling the problem. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, it is a counterintuitive notion, actually, but in organizations and in people, for that matter, as we move through transitions, which is the psychological component of dealing with change, we start typically in denial. We'll get a piece of information, something's not working, something's not right, whatever. But it takes a while for that to build up, and we move on to other stages. But one of the keys, if you're leading a congregation, for instance, you're listening to this, and you want to help them become more kingdom centric, for instance, you're going to have to get really good, not at selling all the solutions of stuff, but articulating the problem. Now, there are ways that you sell that problem might be as simple as bringing in that school administrator and letting them talk about what's really going on at school, or the police chief, or the city council person, or putting them on a panel, or having them sequentially once a month to come and just to hammer this home, just to begin to say, here's what's going on around us. Because I think until we get people up to our level of dissatisfaction, you're not going to be able to generate the requisite energy to move people into toward that need, to get off their donkey and go to the other side of the road and help somebody. And I mean, we just, as you and I are recording this, we're just celebrating 50 years of the horrific assassination of Dr. King. And if you think about one of the magnificent contributions he made was to foment dissatisfaction with the status quo. And he was able to sell the problem in a way that people could grasp it, could articulate it, could come around it. I mean, there were a lot of people who had his similar message. And there were a lot of people who, had his level of dissatisfaction, but he became so good at selling the problem that it was able to generate a movement. So whatever it is you're trying to get done as a leader, get really good at telling people why, not just the what we need to do, but the why we need to do it.
Yeah. And I've never thought of Dr. King in that way, but that is true. He did have a way of helping a lot of other people around the country agree that there was a problem with racial segregation, racial strife, the lack of civil rights, and people needed to come to agree that there was a problem before they could buy into the dream. He's most known for that "I have a dream" speech, but they couldn't hear that "I have a dream" speech until they were more along the path of, that we have a problem right around us.
Yes, and just as an example, to use in that speech, I have a dream that all God's children. I mean, what a brilliant way of selling the problem. We are all, he strummed that chord of a nation that was far more, attuned with those kinds of spiritual conversations 50 years ago than we are now. But he was able to connect with that sense of universal right as all God's children, that we would be able to experience the similar opportunities. It was his way of selling the problem that was quite brilliant. As well as true.
Absolutely.
It always helps if what you're saying is true.
Well, so just to move to wrap this up, you travel around and you're doing different things. I know you worked with Leadership Network a little bit. What are you doing these days? What is besides writing books and talking? What's your projects?
Yeah, I was at Leadership Network for 10 years on their staff. Of course, I worked with them a long time. They published most of my books in the early days, and then I worked with their folk there, and then they made me a senile fellow. Last year, I just say that again, grinning. Their senior fellow is as part of, I guess, some honorific for all those years, and I still stay in contact with them. But practically, and every day, I've decided to move my portfolio, the center of it, to an organization called Good Cities. It's been a one-man operation out of Minneapolis. Glenn Barth is the president, very smart man, very much in touch with all these city movements that are beginning to spring up all over. They go by various names, and under various monikers and under various banners, but he's just really encyclopedic. You can name a city, and Glenn can tell you the various groups, from the faith-based world that are operating there. And what I want to do is help Glenn expand and build a more robust engagement around this idea of actually going into cities and helping those leaders synergize and catalyze collaborative efforts that move the needle on big societal issues. That's our dream.
I love it. So you're stepping out into actually doing what you talk about in your books. That's that, that's a,
Well, you know what's fascinating, for the last 10 years at Leadership Network, I worked with a lot of congregations that many of them large congregations who had dreams for their cities, and helped them strategize on ways to, they would come to Dallas, we'd sit in a room and maybe with 10 other teams or whatever, and we would talk about how you lead movements and those kinds of things. And then they would go home and do it. But I'm kind of wanting to flip that script a little bit and say, instead of inviting 10 teams from from 10 cities or 6 cities to come and sit here in Dallas and strategize on their community, why not go into the community and have 10 teams of, folks in the community from all various domains, education, government, healthcare, faith-based, whatever, and strategize there on the ground about how they can make some difference. And I think that will accelerate that development. I'm looking forward to, I won't talk here about where, because I don't want to get in the way of this, but we're in conversation here early on with several cities where that looks like that's going to happen. And then once we can establish some of those practices, we can share those with other cities.
great. It sounds exciting. It sounds really
Hope so.
engaging too. Well, thank you for this conversation. I got some great pointers myself out of this, and your book is it's very readable. It's definitely the kind of thing that people in a congregation you gather their leadership around, and it very helpful at the back, some kind of practical questions to get people thinking and focused on. So,
Jim, I appreciate it. And actually, that was one of my dreams about this volume. I mean, previously, as you've mentioned, I've written a bunch of stuff, and it's typically targeted church leaders. But a lot of times, it's just for the central leadership or whatever, or maybe even the pastor or whatever would read it for his own development or her own development. In this case, I really wanted to create a conversation, as well as be instructive around some of these competencies that are required for kingdom movement leadership. But I really am finding that a lot of people are responding and say, we can get our whole leadership team reading this, and this will up our game across the board. And that way you're not having to be the sole person, even a sole change agent or whatever. You've got a bunch of people working on helping you to move forward. So that's one of my big hopes for this book.
I hope it's not only a success, but I really hope it makes a difference and helps some congregations, because I think there is, as we have talked about, there's a world of hurt out there, and we have an opportunity as God's people to speak a word of hope into that, and that can be both words and deeds that would make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jim. I enjoyed it, and God's people are good, and I'm just glad to come alongside God's good people and help them to release the good that's in them for the good of our cities and the good of our communities.
Thanks so much.